All right, it's Monday night, and we are beginning Parashat Chukat, reading Parashat Chukat this week. And as we continue with Rabbi Josh Vagelson asking big questions, um, this week's particularly spoke to me, as did last week's. Um, and I'm going to jump right in, share my screen. Okay, the question that he asks from this week's Parashah is, how do we rebuke? And he begins, like many other people, one of the most difficult things for me to do is give negative feedback. Whether at work, at home, or in public, I routinely run into internal fears when the situation invites pointing out to someone else what's wrong with their behavior. Remember that last week was how do we argue? This is a different, feels a little bit less like it's about how do we engage with each other when we disagree, and a little bit more on the nose, how do we engage with someone when we feel that they've done something wrong? Um, I'm worried about how they'll feel, about the conflict that is likely to be generated, about seeming judgmental or self-righteous. The thought of rebuking someone often feels icky. At the same time, as I have gotten older, I think he's probably in his early 50s, if I had to guess, I've come to appreciate hearing negative feedback about myself because I've learned how essential it is for me to grow. How essential it is for me to grow. As a parent and a leader, I've also developed a deeper appreciation for the reality that my critical feedback, and even occasional strong rebuke, is necessary for the good of my family or the group or organization I lead. Sometimes, without being aware of it, we test the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And at those times, I have found it is important not only for me, but for other members of the group and for the organization as a whole, for me to firmly draw a line and say, that's out of bounds. How do we give critical or negative feedback? How do we acknowledge the powerful emotions that might be at play within ourselves, the object of our feedback, and other observers or members of a group? And most importantly, how do we offer critique and rebuke in ways that lift up the divine presence rather than diminish it? So, as is often the case, we start out, we don't even yet know the connection to our Parsha. We want to frame a broader issue. Kind words and harsh words. Listen, you rebels, Shim'una Hamorim. Shall we get water out of this rock? Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. Moshe says angrily to the people in Parshat Chukat. He then proceeds to strike the rock, and indeed brings forth water, but in the process violates God's instruction to speak to the rock. As a result, God decrees that Moshe will not enter the promised land, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people. The enough is an interesting translation. The Hebrew is Ya'an lo ha'emantem bi. You didn't trust me or believe in me. Lahakti sheni, to affirm my sanctity or to sanctify me in the sight of the Israelite people. So the enough is, I think, a translator's commentary in order to bridge the fact that how could we say that Moshe didn't believe in God or trust God, but didn't do it enough? Classical commentators have long struggled to understand the nature of Moshe's failure here, that it merited such a significant consequence. Probably see on the Torah.com, I don't know for sure, I haven't checked, but that's the kind of place where you might find analyses that actually suggest that this is sort of a cover. This isn't the real reason Moshe was always meant to not be able to go into the land. Um, but here it's being presented as the reason, and it's a hard reason to swallow. For this one misdeed, does he really merit, or is the punishment warranted to not be able to go into the land? Rashi's explanation focuses on the opportunity for spiritual education that Moshe seems to have missed. So Rashi on, you did not trust me enough, lahakti sheni, to sanctify me or to affirm my sanctity, comments, for had you spoken to the rock, and it then brought forth water, I would have been sanctified before the whole congregation. For they would have said, consider that this rock, which cannot speak and cannot hear, and needs no sustenance, yet it fulfills the bidding of the omnipresent God, how much more should we do so? Right? So there was a missed opportunity. If Moshe had spoken to the rock and then it brought forth water, that would have allowed the people to learn a lesson about their own responsibilities vis-a-vis God, and he missed that opportunity. Sorry for the blurry page top here. Ramban, Nachmanides, who's about 100 years or so, 150 years after Rashi, takes a different approach, following Maimonides and emphasizing that Moshe's anger provided a poor moral example to his followers. The Ramban says that Maimonides understands Moshe's sin to be that he inclined to anger when he said, "Listen, you rebels." God held him to a high standard, for when someone of Moshe's station gets angry with the Israelites when it is not appropriate to be angry, and any situation similar to that, where such behavior would be considered a desecration of the divine name, everyone looks to him and learns from his words and actions, right? So rather than the idea that it was a missed opportunity, look at what Moshe could have enabled the children of Israel to learn about their own behavior, doing God's bidding. It's not the focusing on the missed opportunity, but on the wrongful role modeling. Moshe's angry reaction teaches Bnei Yisrael to get angry in situations like this instead of exercising patience. Commenting on both of these commentaries, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. So now we move to our Hasidic teaching as we do in each parasha with Rabbi Josh Vegelson here. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev offers a lesson on rebuke, and particularly on giving it from either a place of anger or a place of love. Got a long Kedushat Levi, his comments on the Parsha. This is the fourth of them, and here it is in translation. Speak to the rock in their sight, right? That was God's instruction to Moshe. And then Moshe gets angry and hits the rock, and then God's punishment or consequence follows. For you did not show faith in me to sanctify me before the children of Israel. Rashi and Ramban disagree about Moshe's sin. You can understand how Rabbi Finkelson, built this out. He had the Kedushat Levi that he liked. It's built on the Rashi and Ramban, so he introduces us to Rashi and Ramban's commentaries. And now we're situated to understand better the Kedushat Levi that's going to follow. Rashi and Ramban disagree about Moses' sin. One explains that Moshe said to Israel, "Listen, you rebels," and one says that it is because he hit the rock. It would appear that they are really one and the same explanation, for one leads to the other. For there are two types of people who rebuke Israel to do the will of the holy, blessed Creator. The first is the one who rebukes with good words, telling each person of the greatness of their high station and the source from which their soul was chiseled. For in truth, the soul of a Jew is formed on high from the throne of glory. We've got to go back to the Hebrew. This is very rich and beautiful Hebrew. To tell every man of Israel, every person of Israel, Godel Ma'alato, the greatness of their elevated status. Umakom Mikol Machzav Nishmato, and the place which is the source from which their soul is hewn. Asher Be'emet, because in truth, Nishmat Yisrael, every Israelite soul, Chatzuva Lamala is hewn from above, Mikisei Kavod, from the throne of glory. Right? So you gotta the first mode of rebuke is to tell people how holy and divine each person is, and the great pleasure that God derives from the performance of each and every mitzvah by each and every Jew. We're just on the heels of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's yahrzeit, very evocative of Chabad approach here. And the happiness that occurs in all the worlds when a Jew performs the command of the Creator. In this manner, this person inclines the heart of the children of Israel to do the will of the Creator, for each to take on the yoke of divine sovereignty. But there's also the one who rebukes Israel with harsh words, with shaming words, compelling them to do God's will. The difference between them? The one who rebukes Israel with good lifts up the soul of Israel higher and higher. They constantly speak of the righteousness and greatness of Israel, of how great their power is to ascend in the supernal realms. This one, meaning the person who rebukes with good, is fit to be a leader of Israel. Echoing in my ears the language of the smicha ceremonies, in particular YCT smicha, in which they say that, by character and training, we have found you fit to be Rav umanhig b'Yisrael, a rabbi and a leader of Israel, right? So these are qualities that are appropriate for a leader of Israel. But the one who rebukes Israel with harsh words is not like this. The one who rebukes with goodness and speaks constantly of their righteousness and greatness. As a result of this, every part of creation must ipso facto do the will of Israel and perform that for which it was created, for the sake of the people of Israel. Okay, this is based, he'll unpack this a little bit more later, but it's based on a very ethnocentric, almost literally, so to speak, worldview. This goes back to the first Rashi. I think it's the first Rashi in the Torah on Bereshit, Bishvil Reshit, for the first, which is a reference, as the sages unpack it, a reference to the Jewish people who are called the first of God. So we have here a very Israel-centric view of the world, in which the creations of the world were created to perform a role on behalf of the Jewish people. But if one does not speak this way, one will be required to use great force to get creation to fulfill its purpose, which in the supernal realms is aligned with Israel's will. Okay, so almost either way, things are supposed to function in a way which is aligned with the will of Am Yisrael, but but you can't automatically get it to follow that path without somehow forcing it or praising it so that it sort of naturally follows this path. Thus, when Moshe says here, "Listen, you rebels," he rebukes Israel with harsh words. So again, remember, we've got the one who is fit to be a leader of Israel is the one who rebukes with good words. But now when Moshe says, "Listen, you rebels," he rebukes Israel with harsh words. Therefore, he must strike the rock in order to get it to fulfill its purpose. Because he's not speaking lovingly to it, it's not naturally following the course of its purpose of creation to fulfill the needs of the Jewish people. So he has to use brute force because he didn't use loving language. If he had exalted Israel as we have described, which is what God wants, and spoken to the rock, he would have said something like, "You that were created for Israel, who are so exalted, you must fulfill your purpose, namely to give forth water for Israel." But because he rebuked Israel with harsh words, he had to strike the rock to make it do the will of Israel. And thus we see that one kind of behavior causes the other. And in this manner, the two explanations are one. So remember, the first explanation was that he didn't seize on the opportunity to get Bnei Yisrael to see, that they can do God's bidding just like the rock, i.e., he criticized them harshly. And then the second, striking the rock, and one leads to the next. This is hinted at in the words of the verse, "For you did not have faith in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel." One who rebukes Israel through goodness is able to bring people or the people to a greater level of insight. This is suggested by "to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel," right? It could have, the most simple language might have been "in front of," lifnei b'nei Yisrael. But we have the less common term here, lahakdisheni, to sanctify me, le'einei b'nei Yisrael, in the eyes of the children of Israel. As our sages taught, the eyes of the people are its wise ones. We often have that idea, chacham einav birosho, a sage is someone who has their eyes in their head. So there's a connection between wisdom and the eyes. If Moshe had acted with kindness, then the whole people would have come to this insight as well. Okay, so that's the Kedushat Levi. Now we'll get Rabbi Fagelson's unpacking. The Kedushat Levi invites us to explore some of the inner life dimensions of this difficult question of negative feedback, critique, and rebuke. When we speak harshly to others, the Kedushat Levi, it seems to suggest, we start down a path that evokes and perhaps even leads to physical violence. Since Moshe started out by speaking harshly to the people, he inevitably wound up needing to hit the rock. And it is both parts of the action, the speech and the hitting, which came as a result, that constitute his failure. Speech and action are linked, and in this case, he suggests, harsh words led to harsh action. By contrast, had Moshe rebuked the people lovingly by reminding them of the divine presence within, between, and amongst them, he wouldn't have needed to hit the rock. His words would have sufficed. Powerful speech, which is both grounded in and expressing of the loving connection that binds us, the material world and the divine, together, would ultimately be the means of bringing forth water from the rock. Of course, this is easier said than done, even for Moshe, and all the more so for us. When we are tired, angry, and stressed, we are more easily triggered, and our anger becomes more liable to flare up. That's precisely why we practice mindfulness. We always come back to mindfulness with Rabbi Fagelson, so that we can be more aware of what's happening in our minds, hearts, and bodies, and become more intentional in choosing our response, rather than reacting out of base emotions. But the Berditchever, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, helps us understand that there's even more to it than this. It is not only a matter of managing our emotions, but also of living in harmony and alignment with the divine call within us. When Rabbi Levi Yitzchak speaks of the link between rebuking with good words and the rest of creation performing its intended purpose, I understand him to mean that rebuking with good words helps us live in alignment with our own deepest nature. And when we are aligned with our own purpose, the rest of the world can be too. If we aren't, then neither is the rest of the world. A useful related concept in this discussion is dignity. We're almost at the end here. God's statement to Moshe that you did not have faith in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel could be understood to say that God felt as though God's dignity were violated. Harvard University scholar Donna Hicks observes how the honoring or violation of dignity is central to how we deliver and receive critique and rebuke. She writes, "The wounds we inflict on one another during a breakdown of a relationship are not only painful, but also often humiliating. Whoever said sticks and stones will break my bones, but words can never hurt me, got it wrong. Words can be used as weapons to psychologically annihilate people's dignity, their sense of value and worth. It's like aiming for the heart when you want to physically destroy someone. Words that take aim at dignity can inflict pain that is devastating. But unlike a physical injury, there are no broken bones, no blood, no obvious sign of a wound. The pain that results from interactions that violate dignity remain invisible, causing people to suffer silently. The emotional volatility of having our dignity honored or violated cannot be overstated. When people feel that their value and worth are recognized in their relationships, they experience a sense of well-being that enables them to grow and flourish. If, by contrast, their dignity is routinely injured, relationships are experienced as a source of pain and suffering." In this final paragraph, Hicks echoes Reb Levi Yitzchak. When we can offer critique in a way that enhances human dignity, that speaks in kind words, that builds and raises up rather than humiliates and tears down, it isn't just a virtuous social psychological circle we set in motion. The sense of well-being that enables them to grow and flourish, brought about by dignity-affirming words, is, in the Kedushat Levi, the alignment of the deepest workings of the universe with our own essence and that of the Creator. Okay, a few questions for conversation and reflection. I won't read them fully, but he asks about a passage that says, when you rebuke in the good way, then sort of the will of creation all aligns. How do we understand that? Can you identify a moment in your own life when you received the kind of loving, dignity-affirming critique that Hicks and the Kedushat Levi speak of? What did it feel like? Were you able to receive it lovingly, or did it take time? How did it change your behavior and, more importantly, your sense of self in the world? And how did you behave following this sort of critique? Would you say it's relatively easy or relatively hard for you to offer critique in this way? What makes it so? Is it something you work on? How do you do it? Would it interest you? And now some ideas for practice. We don't always get to these, but they're worth reading here, I think, in particular. The following practice suggestions were originally offered by my colleague, Rabbi Mark Margolius, also part of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, as part of his series Pitrei HaLevavot, Heart Openings. In the heat of this season, try to find a Kabbalah or commitment to chill yourself internally when you face a situation which might agitate or stir you up. You might look for a stone or rock to represent the rock struck by Moses, a rock to keep in your pocket and hold, or to keep on your desk as a reminder to breathe, to notice internal agitation, and to allow it to pass before speaking or acting. Find or compose your own focus phrase. These are very much in the school of Musar, of character trait refinement. Find or compose your own focus phrase, which can bring your attention to any feelings of resentment or anger. Examples might be, may I be with these feelings. These too shall pass. Or may you, as in God, lead me beside still waters. These little phrases we could compose that speak to us and summon them in times when we need them. Finally, a quote from the author of the Cheshbon HaNefesh, which was a book which bears a lot of similarities to the kind of trait journal in Ben Franklin's Almanac. There's been some interesting academic study of the overlap between these books, but from Rav Menachem Mendel of Satanov's Cheshbon HaNefesh, Musar book, which Rabbi Yisrael Salanter really popularized and encouraged people to study. He has a trait journal with a set of prompts and practices. And he writes in one of the sections, or maybe in the introduction, rise above events that are inconsequential, both bad and good, for they are not worth disturbing your calmness of soul. One of the traits in his book is equanimity. I'm guessing it's from that section. This week, see if you can identify small daily situations which tend to stir you up, and identify which you would consider consequential, worth attending to, and which are inconsequential, not really worth attending to. You might silently label these experiences as they arise, filing them as appropriate. So these are sort of all, it's interesting, these are all, practices which come before the action of rebuke and help us process the things that might stir us to rebuke and help us figure out what's not even worthy of the rebuke. But what's not fully addressed here is how one then engages in the Hicks/Reb Levi Yitzchak practices of loving, constructive critique, feedback, rebuke, however we want to term it here, which doesn't even quite get a chance to get to. So a lot here, a few takes on the story of hitting the rock and Moshe's interaction with it, and the Rav Levi Yitzchak. Happy to hear wide range of comments and reactions of any kind here. I see Bracha's hand first. Happy to hear as many voices as we can. Yeah, Bracha.
I'm sorry that I was a little delayed because Rabbi Berman was speaking at Lincoln Square, and he was supposed to be done earlier, but I was like hanging on every word. So I don't know what I missed, but there were two things that just jumped out of me in terms of the phrase Bishvil the Bishvil Reshit. That if you don't take Bishvil as meaning because of, and if you don't take it as being specific to the Jewish people, what you might take shvil as is a path towards.
Mm.
And the path is towards Reshit. And Reshit is being able to see something for the very first time, like the beginning of creation. So that seems like a good attitude to have as you're encountering someone. Not
Mm.
going by the old, oh, they've been complaining for almost 40 years now, like but to really see them in a fresh light, what exactly might it be that's concerning them right now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yes, just trying to pull open so people can see the text you're referring to for a moment. Hold on. Uh, so this is Rashi. It's really it's printed as the second Rashi on the word Breshit. Let's see if I can see it myself. Hold on. It's a little bit narrow and complex here. Um, but the question is the translation of the word Breshit. Um, and here we have, are we still in Rashi? I think so. 1 minute. Yeah. God created the world for the sake of the Torah, which is called the beginning of God's way, and for the sake of Israel, who are called the beginning of God's increase or bounty. And the Hebrew there is Bishvil HaTorah and then Bishvil Yisrael Shenikra'u Reshit. So I love your suggestion of reading Shvil as the path towards Israel, who is called first, or the path of the Torah. So there's a sense of kind of direction and orientation, not just having already arrived and not being for the sake of, but on the way. Great. We'll go mom and dad, then Moshe, and then Lance.
Okay. Moshe is, in this incident, is striking the rock instead of speaking to it. So it turns out that Aviva Zornberg, in her book on Bamidbar, has a footnote where she says something to the effect that it's worth looking at the second chapter of Shemos to see when Moshe goes out from the palace of the Pharaoh. And the first time he goes out, he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave. And Moshe strikes him. And the second day he goes out, it doesn't say where he went out from. Moshe sees Israelite abusing another Israelite. And this time he speaks to him. Why are you
Mm-hmm.
hurting him? So he's gone from striking to speaking in Shemos, and here in Bamidbar, he's going from the requirement to speak to the act of striking.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I understand it in Shemos, when Moshe goes out the first day, he's still under the influence of the palace, a dictatorship, a violent dictatorship. And it's just natural for him to see something he doesn't think is right. He hits the guy. Something happened that night, and just my idea is somehow he got back to where the Israelites were, and he spent the night with his family. And when he went out the next day, he sees the same incident. Somebody's abusing somebody else, and he speaks to him. Something happened to him that changed him.
Wow.
Now, in Bamidbar, if Moshe is acting violently, to me, he's reverted back to the way he was when he came out from the palace. And if has a little bit of Egypt left in him, he's no longer the man to lead the Israelites. All of the Israelites who have been enslaved had now died. This is a new generation. They need a leader who's not an Egyptian anymore. So that's what I think has happened.
Wow, fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I guess the piece I would be wondering about is, what causes the regression or the reversal um, at that moment. Why is he, turning back to his inner Egyptian or whatever it's obviously all stereotyping, but um, be interesting to look at that story with an eye to, was there something that triggers or draws out that part of him in particular? Yeah.
I think in that regard, I think um, the reason why there's no water is that Miriam has died.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a devastating, something devastating happened to Moshe.
Mm-hmm.
This was his sister when she had leprosy, the way he pleads with God to heal her.
Yeah.
Having lost her, um, it's almost as if he doesn't know what to do.
Yeah. Great answer. Great answer. Thank you. Joan and Moshe.
One, maybe Moses was really had enough. It was like his metaphorically, you really want to strike against the Jews. I did everything for you, and now you're complaining. That's how I look at it. And the part that what Bracha made, in Parashah, did God create the Torah first, or he created the Jewish people first? It's one of the interpretation of, I think Rashi says, why did what is the beginning of the Torah begins almost like in a fable, and because they said there'll come a time when the world will say that the Jews stole the land, and God's saying, well, number one, I created the land and I gave that portion, so did he create, the Torah first, and the Jews were second, or just it didn't matter which order it came from?
Yeah. Great question. There are many traditions that the Torah came before everything. Kabbalistic traditions that God looked into the Torah to create the world. There's certainly the way the rabbis view Torah certainly feels like it's something which predates the Jewish people. Um, but there is a firstness quality to each of them that kind of creates this connection.
Mm.
There's a very much a Israel-centric, as I said, view that's being presented here, and that's put back into the very beginning of the Torah, even when we're talking about the creation of the world. Yeah, yeah, great. Lance.
Okay. I want to talk about speaking and striking.
Great.
Speaking for me is diplomacy. Striking for me is military intervention. And it seems to me that the art of the deal is ceasefire. And it seems to me that unconditional surrender is true victory.
Say the second word, unconditional surrender?
Unconditional surrender is what victors should get, not ceasefire. All ceasefire does is give the opponent a chance. Iran says, we won. We won this war. Great words. It's bull. Should pardon my expression. And there's words about, was the nuclear reactor destroyed? Was it not destroyed? Well, if you really put those bunker buster bombs against anything, that's pretty much the equivalent of dropping an atomic bomb without radiation. I mean, if the way it was presented, that I think it should be obliterated. I have no idea. I have no idea what's going on there. I just want to ask another question, and that is, where else in the Torah does somebody strike a rock and get water?
Moshe does so earlier in the Torah.
Exodus 17, right?
Yeah,
And so there, God says, strike the rock and get water.
yeah, very
Here, God
confusing.
says, speak, and Moses strikes the rock and gets water. Now, what is to say that Moses wasn't thinking about what happened in Exodus 17 and that it was perfectly normal, perfectly legitimate for Moses to say that? The problem that I have here is the problem with Torah. There are those who say that the Torah is one complete work. The problem is that scholars would argue that to have the Torah as we pick it up during services would be far too heavy for ancient scrolls. So therefore, the original audience is looking at smaller scrolls. Probably they're looking at Exodus. Probably they're looking separately at Numbers. And did the original audience remember Exodus 17? We don't know, but it's unlikely that they would do that. So I really, I mean, first of all, I disagree. I disagree with mindlessness because, I mean, not mindlessness, mindfulness, because mindfulness also has a negative side, which is not discussed here, but that mindfulness can cause problems just as, mental problems not discussed here. So you got to be careful when you deal with that. You should really have a professional, expert, certified mindfulness person handling you. But nevertheless, for me, the real question of rebuking is, how do you rebuke God?
Mm,
And Leonard Cohen said it best when he said, if you are the dealer, God, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, God, I'm broken and lame.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you asked the question, how do you rebuke God? I certainly was thinking about Abraham's engagement with God around the destruction of Sodom, where he says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat." Will the judge of all the world not act justly? It's it's interesting to analyze that as a rebuke. It does feel like I think it hews towards the positive frame that Reb Levi Yitzchak is suggesting. It's lifting up God's unique qualities and saying, look at what you're capable of, look at what you are, and I would love to see you live up to that definition, right? So it does feel like broadly it fits that mold, and I think that question, we're told in the Torah not to test God. Um, I don't know that we're ever told not to rebuke God. We are charged to rebuke. Again, rebuke never feels like exactly the right word, but reprove something. Our neighbors, thinking about what, it's hard to imagine, um, even though I think we do see biblical characters get frustrated with God, it's hard to imagine there being any room for speaking to God in the negative rebuke frame. But something about the structure of the loving reproof feels like it could be a mode of interacting with God. So especially appreciate you raising that.
What about Elisha ben Abuya Aher? Doesn't he rebuke God?
No.
Yeah, he must. I don't have those stories fresh at my fingertips.
Well, it's the one where the bird's nest, and
Yes, yes,
the first person waits until the bird goes and takes the egg out, and the second person takes the egg out with the mother bird there, and the person who does it right dies, and the person who does it wrong lives.
right. I don't remember in those stories whether we're just told that upon seeing that Elisha ben Abuya apostatizes or whatever the term is, or whether he says something in those stories. I just don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something worth exploring.
Thank you.
Let's see who else. Mark, great, and then back to Bracha.
I have a question.
Please.
Was not Moshe infused with powers of prescience? Wasn't he prophetic?
Yes.
Because if that were the case, he should have been able to foresee that hitting the rock was not work well for the home team.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it's almost like he put himself in that position purposely.
Interesting argument. Um, you're right that he is described as a Navi. Um, but that term means a range of things biblically. It's mostly not future teller as much as it is vehicle vessel to deliver the word of God. And
You had all these Nevi'im foreseeing what was going to happen if Israel didn't do this, it didn't do that.
right, right. But less saying, you know, right, as you're saying here too, he should have understood or had a communication from God what will happen if he doesn't do the right thing. And maybe he
It's almost like he did it Dafka.
it was a setup or a self-sabotage or something like that. Yeah, it's a in character, Moshe has a problem with anger. And so this also fits that where wasn't necessarily an intentional setup. But like he has this impulse control challenge. Um, but I think your reading is also a fascinating one for this story. Bracha?
Yeah, so now I have two things. One is short. So I'll do the short one first, is in relation to the example of Abraham rebuking God. That's the most famous example, but it wasn't personal. It was about another people. So it's sometimes easier to give grace to another people than to your own close family and extended community that you constantly rub shoulders with. So that's just a quick comment on that. From different things that people have been saying as to why Moshe might have reacted that way, it suddenly occurred to me that could it be that maybe Hashem knew that he might have this anger, but had faith in him that he might be able to rise beyond it. And Dafka was really trying to put him in a position where he could make a different choice from the choice that he made before.
Interesting. Yeah. It certainly could have been like a setup for tshuva kind of thing.
And partly that his having this anger and frustration might also help him to understand better the anger and frustration of the Jewish people at this point as well.
Nice. Thank you. Great thoughts. Of course, there's always so many pieces here. The biblical text from the Parsha that we're, jumping off of, the, applications in other directions. But I don't want us to lose arguably the core question or challenge here, which is how do we actually engage in constructive, effective rebuke to others? When is it appropriate? So we don't have to comment on it now, but I want to just take us back to remembering that is, that's the central framing question of the piece. And I think it is something very much worth reflecting on in the professional context, in the personal context. I think, Rabbi Finkelstein, it felt like when he says, in the family, in the workplace, there is a little bit of a power dynamic or hierarchy that feels like it's being expressed, because it's a different thing than saying this happened and it hurt my feelings, right? He's describing something a little bit more direct or clear, which is to sort of, like he said at the beginning, to set boundaries, to say like this isn't appropriate behavior. But how do you do it in a way that is building up, affirming, that kind of thing? I just think it's a resonant question, as a parent and as a professional, and as a human in the world. So noting that, we'll come to David L. and then back to mom and dad and Isaac. Yep, got everybody. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go back to what Mark said last week. And that is the question about when the stakes are high, right? How do you deal with a Korach? And again, with what your dad said, with regard, it says Vayetze Moshe Lachav. He goes out to his people, Vayar Ish Mitzri, and what he sees is the other, and that's the person that he strikes. And I wish that Rabbi Fagelson, when we're harsh on him, we'll call him Rabbi Fagelson. I wish that he would give us some criteria as to who are the people with whom we would like to rebuke in a loving way and whom we would like to rebuke in a full-throated way. And to give you, and to quote myself from last week I referred to Andrew Sullivan, and some of you may have seen his piece in the opinion section of the New York Times yesterday, which is an extraordinary piece about the evolution of the LGBTQ plus community in the 10 years since the legalization of gay marriage. And the parties and he talks about the missionizing that they did with their opponents in the period up to the Supreme Court ruling, and how they spoke very patiently and in an engaging way. And then he talks in very harsh terms within his own community. So it's just the opposite of what the Berditchever is actually encouraging us to think about. And the final two sentences I'll have is that Lance, diplomacy is what's always needed to turn military victory into a new political reality. And if you like a source, Dennis Ross has got a new book out called Diplomacy 2.0 about coercive diplomacy.
Thank you.
Great.
Good point.
Thank you. All great comments. And yes, it's a very, he opens up a big conversation and gives us very few parameters. And so good we start to work them through together and ask them. And thank you for the great article reference, which I look forward to looking at. Back to mom and dad, and then Isaac to wrap up.
I'm going to go back to Exodus at the burning bush when God tells Moshe, you're going to go to Egypt and you're going to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. And you're going to speak to Pharaoh. And Moshe says, I can't speak. I'm slow of speech. And here in Bamidbar, God is telling Moshe, speak to the rock. How do you speak to a rock? Maybe he's asking Moshe to do something that Moshe is not capable of doing. Never occurred to me that it's another link from Shemos to Bamidbar.
Right. And of course, and I actually think Aviva Zornberg does comment on this, if I remember correctly. Especially in light of what you were saying about his Moshe sort of regressing. But then we come to the book of Dvarim and we have, Moshe, who's not lo ish Dvarim anochi, I'm not a man of words, literally says a whole book of Dvarim. So kind of when is he able to speak and when is he feel unable to speak is a great, topic to reflect on further. So thank you. Isaac?
Yeah, so three quick comments. I agree with your father that when he mentions that this is because, I don't know, in a short order, right after the death of Miriam. And, I don't think it's just accidental that this happens this way and that there's this hurt or sadness or anger, the loss of his older sister, the one who put him in and watched over him, with the in the river. And it makes sense that psychodynamically that he would behave that way. It really makes them very human. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I was curious about the prophets, our prophets, the Nevi'im. I don't know which one actually spoke lovingly about, it seems they were always rebuking the Israelites, the Hebrew, the Jews,
Yeah.
Rather harshly. So,
Yeah.
I think that's something to look at. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that meditation, when I've done some meditation now a lot, it definitely gives one an opportunity to have a buffer zone between what's happening out here and oneself. So there's an opportunity to respond rather than react. That's very important. And I think it's very helpful to I haven't done a practice for myself, but having a few minutes a day to really calm oneself and be clear about intention is very helpful.
Yeah. Beautiful. Great points. And yes, I think, we look to God for a model. We also recognize somehow God is an exception. And the words of the prophets, when delivering God's messages of rebuke to the Jewish people, it's hard to see the loving dimension in them. There's a passage in which in Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Prophets, in which he attempts to argue that actually the whole undergirding of all that fire and brimstone is absolute love, but it's you don't feel it when you're hearing it. So I think it's a great point. Okay, back to bracha for a last quick word. Also, James had asked in the chat about the translation of emunah in Rabbi Josh Feigelson, other places, and it's a good question. I'm not sure whether he's consistent there or not. Would have to look. But bracha, last quick word.
Yeah, just that I'm seeing the trail continuing from what I had thought a few parshas ago, that the speaking badly that happened between Miriam and Aharon about Moshe, that energy transferred to the Jews complaining in the desert about this, that, and the other thing, and maybe has also now impacted Moshe in terms of how he's relating to the people and the rock.
Yeah, nice, very nice. All right, rich text, even richer discussion, and let me take a moment to check next week's schedule. Bear with me a moment. Monday, July 7th. Should be great. Look forward to learning with everyone. Wonderful group. So thank you to all for being here. Love to mom and dad. Good night to everybody. Take care.